On a warm summer morning in June 2013, the coastal town of Crescent Bay slowly came to life. The streets were quiet, the breeze gentle, and the ocean calm under the early sunlight. David Clark, a well-known man in the community, was preparing his small sailboat, the Serafina, for a weekend trip with his 9-year-old daughter, Emily. It was something they did often, a father-daughter tradition that always brought them closer. Friends and neighbors had seen them loading the boat with supplies, food, extra clothing, life jackets, and fishing gear. Everything seemed perfectly normal. They appeared happy, sharing smiles as they pushed off from the marina just before sunrise. Lavra, David's wife, stayed behind, waving them off from the pier with a hopeful heart. It was supposed to be just another peaceful sailing trip, another memory in the making. As the hours turned into days, Lavra went about her weekend, trusting that David and Emily would return as they always did. She cooked dinner, tidied up the house, and occasionally checked the clock, imagining where they might be on the water. She expected them to return by Sunday evening, as planned. But when the sun began to set and there was no sign of the Serafina, her calm turned to quiet concern. She tried to call David's phone, but there was no answer. She told herself there might be poor reception out at sea or that they were simply running late. She waited at the marina until the sky grew dark and the cold crept in, but the boat never appeared on the horizon. By the next morning, panic had set in. Lavra contacted the Coast Guard, reporting her husband and daughter missing. Within hours, search teams were dispatched. Helicopters scanned the coastline, rescue boats combed the waters, and divers searched rocky coves. The entire town became involved, desperate to find them. News spread quickly. Flyers went up, local reporters covered the story, and volunteers gathered to aid in the search. But day after day, no trace of David and Emily was found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. On the fourth day, a Coast Guard vessel spotted something unusual. The Serafina was drifting near a rocky outcrop, several miles from where it was last seen. The boat was intact, showing no signs of damage. The sails were down, the anchor was not deployed, and all supplies appeared to be untouched. Emily's small backpack was still inside the cabin, along with David's wallet and keys. There were no life jackets missing, no signs of a struggle, and no distress flares had been fired. The discovery only deepened the mystery. If something had gone wrong, why had no one called for help? If they had fallen overboard, where were the life vests? Authorities scoured every inch of the surrounding waters, but found nothing more. The official investigation eventually concluded that David and Emily were likely lost at sea, possibly due to an unforeseen accident or sudden weather change. But there had been no storms that weekend, no high winds or rough waves. It didn't make sense. Still, without evidence to suggest foul play, the case was slowly closed, filed away as an unsolved disappearance. Lavra was left shattered. Her home became a quiet shell, filled with memories of laughter that now echoed painfully through empty rooms. She held onto the last photo taken of David and Emily together at the dock, both smiling, unaware of what awaited them. The town grieved alongside her, attending memorial services and offering comfort, but no one could provide answers. Over time, life in Crescent Bay moved forward. Neighbors went back to their routines, the search boats were retired, and the story faded from headlines. But for Lavra, the weight of the unknown never lifted. She kept the Serafina, though she could never bring herself to board it again. It sat at the marina for years, slowly gathering dust, its white hull losing its shine. The boat became a silent reminder of what was taken from her. Every now and then, she would walk to the pier, stand before it, and wonder what really happened. Did they drift too far? Did something unexpected pull them from the boat? Or was there something else, a piece of the story she had never been told? Lavra clung to a thin thread of hope. There were days when she believed David and Emily might still be alive, stranded on some distant shore, waiting to be found. But those moments were quickly swallowed by the harsh reality of time. As the years passed, she began to accept that she might never know the truth. She packed away some of their belongings, though she couldn't bring herself to touch Emily's room. It remained untouched, frozen as it had been the day they left. The small community occasionally whispered about the mystery, but most had moved on. A few believed there was more to the story. Some thought David might have staged the disappearance, for reasons unknown, but there was no evidence to support such theories. Lavra dismissed these ideas, choosing instead to remember David as the loving husband and father she had known. What haunted her most was the quietness of it all. No storm, no wreckage, no goodbye, just an empty boat and endless questions. Each year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, she visited the dock where she had last seen them. She would sit in silence, staring out at the vast, unforgiving ocean, searching for meaning in the waves. The sea had taken them, or so she believed. And with them, it had taken the life she once knew. But the ocean holds secrets. And Lavra, though she didn't realize it then, was still standing at the edge of a story that had not yet fully revealed itself. The truth was waiting, buried under years of silence, patiently biding its time until the day it would resurface. Long years passed since that fateful day when David and Emily vanished without a trace. Time moved forward, but for Lavra, the weight of unanswered questions never loosened its grip. Life forced her to adapt, to carry on with a hollow space inside her, a space where memories of her husband and daughter quietly lived. She changed jobs, redecorated parts of the house, and tried to fill her days with purpose. Yet she always felt as though she were living in a story that had no ending. In the spring of 2025, Lavra made a decision she had delayed for years. The house where she had built her family, where each room whispered their absence, had become too heavy to bear. She decided to sell it. As she cleaned out the attic, sifting through old boxes of clothes, photographs, and dusty souvenirs, she stumbled upon a weathered wooden chest she had never noticed before. It was small, tucked away behind stacks of forgotten things. Her hands trembled as she carefully pulled it out and brushed off the dust. Attached to the lid was a brass nameplate with David's initials engraved on it. Inside, she found sailing maps, maintenance records, and a handful of photographs from their past trips. Beneath these papers was something unexpected, a small, leather-bound journal, secured with a rusted lock. The key was missing, but curiosity overtook her hesitation. She took it to a locksmith the following day, who carefully removed the lock without damaging the cover. Opening the journal, she expected to find sailing notes or perhaps personal reflections about his time at sea with Emily. But the contents immediately unsettled her. Page after page revealed a side of David she had never known. He had documented secret meetings, strange financial transactions, and people he referred to only as them. His neat handwriting described mounting pressure, unpaid debts, and a growing fear for his family's safety. Lavra felt her chest tighten as she read the entries. each one darker than the last. David had been in trouble, serious trouble, and he had hidden it from her. One entry written just 4 days before the sailing trip changed everything. He wrote about his desperation, his inability to see a way out, and the looming threat that terrified him. He mentioned that the weekend sail was not just a trip, but something more, an escape. He did not say from whom or to where, but he made it clear he had made a decision he believed was the only way to protect Emily and possibly Lavra as well. The journal ended abruptly, with no final note, no explanation of what exactly he planned to do. Lavra sat motionless, rereading the words as the edges of her world began to tilt. Could it be possible that their disappearance was not an accident? Could David have intentionally vanished, dragging Emily with him to escape from a danger Lavra had never even known existed? Memories rushed back, details she had ignored at the time because they seemed unimportant. She remembered his late-night phone calls, the way he had become distant in the weeks leading up to the trip, his sudden decision to withdraw cash from their joint account. She had asked about it then, and he had brushed it off, claiming it was for boat repairs. She had believed him. But now none of it made sense. Driven by the weight of the new discovery, Lavra approached the local police department and requested that the case be re-examined. At first, they hesitated, arguing that so many years had passed with no new evidence. But when she showed them the journal, they agreed to take another look. Investigators began by reviewing old case files, retracing David's steps before the disappearance. Financial records showed large, unexplained cash withdrawals in the months leading up to the trip. Lavra had never noticed them because David had handled most of their banking. Additional digging revealed that David had been working as a freelance boat mechanic, often repairing vessels for people outside of their small town. It was during this time that his path had crossed with Victor Hall, a man later identified as a known smuggler involved in illegal activities along the West Coast. The deeper they searched, the more connections surfaced. David had been unknowingly drawn into a dangerous world, agreeing to transport packages without asking questions. By the time he realized what he was involved in, he was already trapped. The journal hinted that when he tried to pull away, threats quickly followed. Laura's heart sank as she realized how isolated he must have felt. He didn't trust the police. He didn't even trust her with the truth. He must have believed that the only way to protect Emily, and perhaps to keep Lavra safe, was to disappear completely, to remove themselves from reach. Investigators found additional fragment surveillance footage from a gas station near a northern marina showing David and Emily fueling the boat just before they vanished. Witnesses had come forward back then, but no one had pieced it together. It was as though the clues had always been there, waiting for someone to look at them through the right lens. One retired detective, who had worked the original case, admitted he had always felt something was missing. But without evidence, his theory had gone nowhere. Now with the journal in hand, the case took on a new life. Investigators widened their search beyond local waters, exploring the possibility that David had planned an escape route far more elaborate than anyone had assumed. Laura's emotions became a storm: grief, confusion, betrayal, and a spark of hope she didn't know whether to embrace or fear. The man she had mourned for 12 years might not have died that day. The daughter she had buried in her heart might still be alive, somewhere, having grown up far away from the life she had known. But if David had survived, why had he never come back? Why had he never sent a message, a letter, any sign that he was still out there? Had he truly believed she was safer left behind in sorrow? Or was the threat so permanent that he could never risk revealing himself, even after all these years? The weight of the truth pressed heavily on Lavra as she stared at the final pages of the journal. The trip had not been an accident. It had been a planned escape, but to where and at what cost remained hidden, buried under time and distance. The answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered, and for the first time in 12 years, the door to the mystery had opened again. The police began following the threads of David's secret life, reaching into places they had not considered during the original investigation. Records from the years before his disappearance painted a complicated picture. David had made quiet connections with people far beyond their small coastal town. He had worked on boats that were later linked to illegal activities, though at the time, no one suspected he was involved. The journal pointed to a name, Victor Hale, a man who had vanished from the authorities' radar around the same time David and Emily disappeared. Hale's criminal background revealed a long history of smuggling, transporting goods through isolated ports, and using small, unnoticed fishing boats to move contraband. Digging deeper, investigators uncovered evidence that David had been used as an unknowing transporter. He had been asked to carry what he thought were innocent cargo shipments, only to realize later they contained illegal goods. Once he became aware of the truth, he had tried to distance himself, but by then, it was too late. The people he worked for were dangerous, and pulling away from them was not an option. According to the entries in his journal, David had begun receiving threats. He wrote of shadowy figures watching him, of anonymous phone calls late at night, and of vehicles parked outside their home for hours before quietly disappearing. These people, he believed, had eyes everywhere. David's growing fear had made him a man trapped in his own life. He believed that even the police could not help him, possibly thinking they were compromised or too powerless to protect his family. His plan to escape had likely been forming long before that final sailing trip. The withdrawals from their bank accounts now seemed deliberate, part of a careful strategy to fund their disappearance. David had bought survival supplies, extra fuel, false identification papers, and maps leading far beyond their usual sailing routes. The trip was not a weekend adventure. It had been the first step of a carefully plotted escape. The police followed financial records and sightings that led them north. Reports surfaced from a small marina in Washington state where a man and a young girl, matching David and Emily's descriptions, had been seen refueling their boat in the days following their disappearance. Security camera footage was poor, but the time frame and details matched. From there, they found records showing the same boat, the Serafina, docked briefly before it was reportedly sold under a false name. The trail then extended toward Canada, where border logs from 12 years ago were incomplete, but hinted that an unidentified boat crossed into Canadian waters around that time. Lavra, now gripped by the possibility that her husband and daughter had survived, struggled with conflicting emotions. She had spent years buried in grief, only to realize the people she had mourned might have still been alive, perhaps watching from afar, perhaps moving forward without her. She wondered whether David had planned to return when the danger passed, or whether cutting ties had always been part of his escape. The journal had not provided that answer. Investigators contacted Canadian authorities and expanded their search into remote coastal towns and small inland communities where people could easily live unnoticed. It was in one of these places, a quiet town several miles from the shoreline, that they found a lead. An old marina owner recalled a man arriving by boat over a decade ago, accompanied by a young girl. They used cash, stayed only briefly, and then disappeared inland. The man had given his name as Daniel Carter, but something about the memory stuck with the marina owner. When shown photos of David, he confirmed the resemblance. It was a small but critical piece of the puzzle. The search then shifted toward isolated towns deeper in the Canadian wilderness. In these remote communities, people came and went without much notice. It was easy to start over, to blend in, to be whoever you claimed to be. Local records eventually revealed that a man named Daniel Carter had settled in one of these towns with his daughter, Emma. The names were different, but the birth dates aligned perfectly with David and Emily Clark. School records showed that Emma Carter had enrolled in a small local school, quietly completing her education without raising suspicion. They had built new lives, carefully detached from their past. Further checks confirmed that Daniel Carter worked as a mechanic, mostly repairing fishing boats, avoiding anything that would draw attention. He lived simply, paid in cash whenever possible, and stayed away from large towns. Every action appeared to have been chosen to stay hidden. When investigators pieced the evidence together, they knew they had found David and Emily. The discovery sent shockwaves through Laura's life. After 12 years, the mystery had finally cracked open. But the answers were not as simple as she had imagined. The police approached the Canadian authorities carefully, aware that this was not just a matter of confirming identities. It was a story that stretched across years, borders, and criminal threats that might still linger in the shadows. Once everything was verified, Laura was informed. She sat in silence as they told her what they had found, that David had staged their disappearance, changed their names, and built a hidden life far away from the dangers that once pursued him. Emily had grown into adulthood, her childhood shaped, not by the home she had left behind, but by the new life David had created for them. Questions flooded Laura's mind. Why had David never come back? Why had he not reached out when the danger had passed? Had he truly believed that she would be safer if he remained a ghost in her life? Did Emily remember her mother, or had the years built walls that could not be crossed? The investigators explained that David had left no trace that could lead anyone back to Laura. He had carefully erased his digital footprint, sold the original boat, and created an entirely new history for himself and Emily. His plan had worked. He had disappeared so completely that even the people who once hunted him had likely lost track. Laura's grief transformed into something complicated. Relief that they were alive mixed with sadness for all the years lost. She had been living half a life while David and Emily had been building another somewhere else. She wondered whether David had been selfish or whether he'd made an impossible choice. Perhaps in his mind, leaving her behind was the only way to save her. The investigation continued, but it was now moving toward something more personal. Laura was given the opportunity to decide what would come next. The man she had mourned, the daughter she had grieved, were not gone. They had simply lived in a different story, one that had finally been uncovered. The reunion, if it were to happen, would not simply be a joyful homecoming. It would be the collision of two lives that had drifted apart for more than a decade, stitched together by secrets and shaped by decisions that could not be undone. The final pieces of the puzzle began falling into place as the investigators traced David and Emily's movements through the quiet corners of Canada. where few people asked questions and even fewer paid attention to strangers. The town where they eventually settled was small, isolated, and surrounded by forests that stretched endlessly in every direction. It was the kind of place where people came to escape the noise of the world, where anonymity was part of the landscape. Here, David had successfully hidden in plain sight for 12 long years. David, now known as Daniel Carter, had carefully rebuilt his life, brick by brick, as far away from his former self as possible. He had taken up simple work as a local boat mechanic, repairing fishing vessels and logging equipment for cash. He had rented a modest cabin near the outskirts of the town, avoiding anything that would tie him too deeply to government systems. He paid rent in cash, did not open any official bank accounts, and lived without a cell phone. Every decision seemed carefully measured to prevent his past from finding him. Emily, now 21, had grown up in this hidden life, attending a local school under her new name, Emma Carter. Her records showed she was quiet, distant, and rarely spoke of her family. Teachers noted that she never mentioned her mother or any relatives beyond her father. To the people around her, she was just another young girl from a quiet family. But to Lavra, those records were a window into a life she had never been allowed to witness. The local authorities confirmed that neither David nor Emily had ever left the area for more than a few days at a time. They had lived cautiously, moving only once to a smaller cabin when David believed they might have drawn unwanted attention after a stranger passed through town, asking questions about missing persons. Even after so many years, David had remained vigilant, as if the ghosts from his past were still lurking just beyond the trees. When Lavra learned all of this, she found herself caught between conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to see them immediately, to run to the town where they had hidden and reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Another part hesitated, unsure if she belonged in their world anymore. The years had reshaped them into people she no longer fully knew. Emily, once a little girl with pigtails and a bright smile, was now a grown woman who had spent most of her life believing that her mother had been left behind, or perhaps had never come looking for her. Investigators arranged a quiet approach, carefully avoiding any attention that could jeopardize the delicate situation. They contacted local law enforcement in the Canadian town and worked with them to confirm David's identity without alarming him. Photos were compared, past records reviewed, and eventually, a quiet visit was made to his home. David initially denied who he was. He insisted he was Daniel Carter, a man with no ties to anyone from Crescent Bay. But when confronted with the journal Lavra had found, his defenses slowly collapsed. The weight of 12 years of hiding had taken its toll on him. When pressed, he finally admitted his true identity. He confessed that he had staged his disappearance to escape the dangerous people who had once threatened his family. In his mind, the only way to keep Lavra safe was to let her believe they were gone. He thought that as long as she mourned them, those dangerous people would lose interest in her. He explained that he had monitored the criminal group from afar for as long as he could, but eventually, even they seemed to vanish. Despite that, he never contacted Lavra. He convinced himself that resurfacing would only stir old dangers or cause more harm. The years passed, and the silence stretched longer and longer until he began to believe that reaching out after so much time would bring only pain. David had raised Emily under a carefully constructed story. She knew they had left their old life behind for reasons of safety, but she did not know the full truth. She had grown up believing that her mother had been safer without them, that the sacrifice had been necessary, and that reaching out to her would have reopened risks they had worked so hard to bury. Laura's heart fractured when she learned how Emily had grown up believing in this version of the story. Emily had not forgotten her mother, but years of living under new names and constructed memories had turned the past into something distant, something fragile and uncertain. The authorities informed Laura that she could arrange a meeting if she wished. They advised caution, understanding the complexity of the situation. This would not be a simple reunion. It would be a confrontation of parallel lives that had grown apart under the shadow of secrecy. Laura traveled to the remote town, carrying with her photographs, Emily's childhood drawings, and the memories that had sustained her through 12 years of unanswered grief. The road to the town was long, winding through dense forests and crossing quiet rivers. Each mile brought a mix of anticipation and fear. She did not know if Emily would accept her, if David would be willing to rebuild the connection, or if the walls built by years of separation were now too thick to break. When she arrived, the meeting was arranged in a small neutral place, a park where children played under tall pine trees, a place where the world felt distant and quiet. David arrived. First, his face older, his hair streaked with gray, his posture weighed down by the years. Emily followed, walking slowly, unsure of what to expect, her eyes reflecting a life Laura had missed entirely. There were no words at first, only the heavy silence of recognition, the realization that the people standing before each other were both familiar and foreign at the same time. Laura understood that while she had spent years searching for answers, they had spent those same years building a different life. She was a memory from a world Emily had been forced to leave behind. The meeting stretched for hours. Stories were shared, photographs passed between hands, and slowly, pieces of the broken past began to fit together. Yet, not everything could be restored. There were years lost, moments that could never be recovered. Laura knew that David had acted out of fear, but the consequences had been immeasurable. Emily had grown up without a mother. Laura had mourned without reason, and all of them had paid a price for the decision made that day on the water. The truth had surfaced, but the truth did not heal all wounds. It simply brought light to the spaces where darkness had once lived. The future was uncertain, a delicate balance between what had been lost and what could now be slowly rebuilt. The answers Laura had waited for had finally come, but they came wrapped in the complicated reality of time, distance, and choices that could never be undone. Laura returned home from the remote Canadian town with a heart full of answers but weighed down by the complexity of the truth she had discovered. The meeting with David and Emily had not brought the relief she had once imagined. It had not been a joyful reunion filled with tears of happiness or promises to start again. Instead, it had been a quiet exchange between people divided by years of silence, each carrying their own version of the same story. The reality of the situation was far more complicated than she had ever prepared for. David had changed. The man she had loved was still there, but life on the run, years of hiding, and the burden of protecting Emily had reshaped him into someone distant. His decision to disappear had been final in his mind. Even when the danger had passed, he had not considered returning. He believed the risks were always lingering, like shadows that could never fully be chased away. He confessed that he had convinced himself Laura would eventually heal and move on, that resurfacing would only drag old dangers back to her doorstep. But he had been wrong. The choice he made had not only cost him his own life, but had stolen 12 years from all of them. Emily, too, was no longer the little girl Lara had kissed goodbye at the marina all those years ago. She had grown into a cautious, self-reliant woman, shaped by a life that required constant vigilance. Lara could see it in her eyes, the distance, the uncertainty, the confusion of reconnecting with a mother she had been taught to leave behind. Emily had spent years believing that her absence was an act of protection, that Laura's life had continued peacefully without them. Learning that her mother had grieved, searched, and lived in painful uncertainty for more than a decade shook the foundation of what she had been told. For Lara, the hardest truth was realizing that the family she had lost was not the same as the family she had found. Their lives had splintered in different directions, built around different memories and survival strategies. They no longer fit together as they once had. The pain of separation had etched permanent lines into all of them. Despite this, Lara made the effort to stay connected. She wrote letters to Emily, sent photos, and shared stories from the years they had lost. Emily responded, though cautiously, carefully choosing which memories to revisit and which questions to ask. Lara understood that building trust again would take time, perhaps years. She was willing to wait, willing to step slowly into the fragile space between them. David, however, remained distant. He did not block her out, but he did not invite her in. His life in the remote town had become his reality, and Lara sensed that he no longer saw himself as part of hers. The guilt of his decision lingered in his voice, but he never apologized directly. In his mind, he had made the only choice available to him at the time. Whether that choice had been right or wrong seemed to weigh on him like a burden he could never set down. Back in Crescent Bay, Lara faced the slow process of explaining the truth to those who had supported her through years of mourning. Friends, neighbors, and even the local authorities were stunned when they learned what had really happened. Some found it hard to believe that David could have orchestrated such a disappearance. Others understood the desperation that had driven him to it. For the community, the case that had haunted them for over a decade had finally come to an end. But the ending was not as simple as they had expected. Lara often visited the marina where the Serafina had once been moored, standing quietly as the sea breeze passed over her. The boat had long since been sold, its white hull now likely part of someone else's story. Yet the water remained the same, calm and endless, holding the memories of the day when everything changed. She would stand there for hours, not to mourn anymore, but to reflect on the strange path her life had taken. The years moved forward, and while Lara and Emily never fully returned to the mother-daughter relationship they once shared, they carved out something new. They exchanged messages regularly and visited one another in carefully chosen places far from their past. Their connection was delicate but real, a small thread that survived despite everything that had torn them apart. Emily began asking questions about her early childhood, about Laura's life, and about what had happened after they disappeared. Slowly, the walls between them began to lower. David remained a part of Emily's life, but stayed at the edges of Laura's. He continued to live quietly in the same small Canadian town, avoiding anything that would pull him back toward the life he had fled. Lara accepted that he would likely never return to Crescent Bay, that his journey had taken him somewhere she could not follow. As time passed, Lara found peace in small moments. She found comfort in the fact that Emily was alive and safe, even if they could not fully recover what was lost. The ache of missing 12 years never fully left her, but it softened with time. She learned to carry it without allowing it to. Crusher, for the town of Crescent Bay. The mystery of David and Emily Clark became one of those stories that people would tell for generations. A story of disappearance, deception, and the strange decisions people make when they are cornered by fear. Some would say David was selfish. Others would call him a desperate father who did what he thought was right. But only Laura, David, and Emily would ever truly understand the weight of the choices that had been made. The sea that had once seemed to swallow her family without a trace had not taken them at all. It had simply hidden the truth beneath its surface, waiting for the day when it would finally be uncovered. The answers had come, but they came with scars that time could not fully erase. In the quiet moments of her life, Laura would often return to the marina, close her eyes and listen to the rhythm of the waves. It was no longer the sound of loss. It had become the sound of survival, of truths that refused to stay buried, and of a life that had found its way forward, even when the past could never be perfectly stitched back together. The story had ended, but its echoes would always remain, softly carried by the wind that swept across the endless, watchful sea.